Let me welcome you to this EPN breakfast. I've taken the occasion because the speaker is a very close friend. My younger sister, if I may quote. You wouldn't oppose this younger sister, I guess. Okay, good. She is in Brussels for the last 15 years. 15 or 16 years, I guess. She was before at CEPS, a think tank, Center for European Policy Studies. And for the last almost 10 years, she is now at European Policy Center. An analyst of many issues in the foreign relations, but mostly to the eastern part of Europe. Security, defense, energy, all the high topic and touchy issues she likes to work on. We have a cooperation on Turkish insights for the last 4 years. We are doing events for it. And she is very well known in Turkey because she writes for a Turkish daily 4 times a month. Weekly she writes for today's Zaman. So she's very familiar to Turkish issues, not because she studies on the issue, but she has 3 kids who have Turkish nationalities too. And she also has Turkish nationality, am I right? Yeah. Okay. Some of you may know her with her old surname, which was Akçakoca, so that may be more familiar to you. Today, of course, the topics about neighborhood policy, European security, and what's happening around Russia. And we will gladly hear her comments on it, which for the people living in Belgium, the thing may be far away, but now as Europe, we are a single body. Whatever happens in the eastern borders of Europe does really have an effect on our lives, on our daily lives. We don't feel it now, but we will feel it more if the tension continues, if I may make it easy. So now I will pass the mic to her, and she told me that she would be very much willing to have very hard questions after the debate. Okay, Ahmad, it's yours.
Okay, thank you, Cesar, for that nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today. I was told that I should speak for 45 minutes. But I'm not going to speak for 45 minutes because I think it's too long. And I know from sitting in the audience as a spectator, generally 45 minutes the audience is, particularly bored. So I'm going to make, some comments about the security situation faced by Europe from the east and also from the south. And then I guess the most interesting part is if we can have, a question and discussion session where you can put your questions on anything you like within that neighbourhood, including, of course, related to Turkey. So I think we should start by remembering that 2014 marks the 10th anniversary of NATO and European Union enlargement. And when we think about that, we can say there's no doubt that enlargement in both organisations has definitely contributed to the stability and security of the European continent. And I think this was again recognised in 2012 when the EU was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace for contributing to stability and security through bringing in the states of the former Soviet Union, the communist states, into the EU, obviously for their role at the end of the Second World War, and related to bringing peace to the Balkans. I think that everybody took it for granted, peace and security in Europe, and that we would never face again war on our, let's say, borders. But I think we've seen that what we thought was unimaginable has become imaginable when the Russians invaded Ukraine at the beginning of 2014. So now the EU is faced with a situation where it has war and turmoil to the east, and then of course now in the south, in Syria, we have this significant global threat, because it is a global threat, of ISIS or ISIL, whichever terminology you prefer to use. And of course you could say that IS is the biggest threat, which it is, but at the same time I don't think we can also underestimate the threat that Russia represents to the east, and what that means. And this all comes, I would say, at quite a bad time for the EU. I mean, the EU doesn't really like crises. It doesn't like having to deal with difficult issues when you have 28 member states that obviously have different views frequently on these issues. But at this time, I would say we're faced with a European Union that has no leadership, no vision. It's very internally focused. It doesn't have a particularly good foreign policy outreach. And you have a lot of concern about economy, because of course after the global economic crisis, those states that are now starting to show, let's say, small signs of growth, don't want to do anything that could impact on their growth. And I think the slogan you could say from the EU at the moment is fatigue. It's fatigue for dealing with external crises. Now I'm just going to say a few words about Russia and Ukraine first of all. I mean, Ukraine is a country that's very close to my heart. I've been following Ukraine for more than 10 years. I've been there numerous times. And of course, Ukraine has had problems. I mean, it's had problems since it became independent more than 20 years ago. The main problem being that governance in Ukraine has always been corrupt. It's always been criminal. There hasn't been enough efforts made to, let's say, unite the country, which meant that Russia was able, I would say, to manipulate the situation on the ground. I mean, for Russia, Ukraine is seen as an indivisible part of Russia. It's like an extra arm or a leg, so to speak. And Russia has always wanted to keep Ukraine within its the so-called sphere of influence, as the Russians would say. The idea that Ukraine could move west, integrate with Europe, integrate with NATO, was the worst possible fear of the Russians. So of course the Russians have used the pretext of human rights violations against their minorities in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine to initiate their actions, first of all in Crimea and then in the east. But I mean, it's quite interesting if you think about the fact that Ukraine and Russia signed a friendship treaty in 1997, and between the signing of that treaty and up until the moment that they invaded Crimea, there was never any incident ever where the Russians actually went to an international organization and said, we think there's a problem with the way Russian minorities are treated in Ukraine. This was never the situation. The only situation arrived was when you had this incident in Crimea, and then the Russians came in and used this as a pretext. I mean, I think in the EU or in the West in general, there's still a real lack of understanding or knowledge about Russia. They don't seem to understand the way that the Russians, or I should say specifically President Vladimir Putin actually thinks. They don't understand that it doesn't matter how many sanctions they will put onto Russia, economic sanctions are not going to change his strategic objectives. I mean, as a geopolitical objective, Ukraine is worth the economic sanctions that have been placed on Russia because of his actions in Ukraine. And unfortunately, despite the fact that the sanctions that have been put onto Russia because of its actions in Ukraine have only been placed on Russia for, I don't know, a few months, we already see a distinct fatigue for these sanctions. Some member states want the sanctions lifted already. Some member states don't want to go further with any sanctions. And I think this is tragic because we've seen that despite calls for Russia to de-escalate the situation. I mean, I don't want to give you all the story about what's going on in the east of Ukraine because I guess you all read the newspapers and you already know. But since the signing of the peace agreement, so-called peace agreement, in Minsk in September, where you had 10 points that needed to be adhered to maintain the ceasefire and to de-escalate the situation, we can say that the Russians haven't actually de-escalated whatsoever. You still have an open border between the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk, where there are military soldiers and tanks and whatever crossing backwards and forwards on a daily basis. You now have an escalation of the presence of Russian forces on the border and around the border. You still have the Russian-backed separatists at the moment fighting to try and take more key infrastructure or more territory in the region. I mean, I don't know how familiar any of you are with that situation, but the land that has been taken in Donetsk and Luhansk is not, let's say, one consolidated area. It's in small areas, not linked together. So they're trying to, let's say, fill the gaps in between so that you'd have, let's say, a much bigger area under their control. So you still have this ongoing, what's been termed a hybrid war in that region. It's a war that's not visible, but still it's an ongoing war. And of course, as I mentioned, the main supporter of the activities in that region are the Russians. But according to President Putin, as again we heard yesterday at the G20 summit, when the Canadian Prime Minister asked President Putin, please can you remove your forces from Ukraine, please can you get out of Ukraine? Putin responded by saying, this is impossible because there are no Russians in Ukraine. And he says this, blatantly. I think we all know that's not the truth, but I think it's very clear that this is, a signal from the Russians that they really don't care what the West thinks about what they're doing in Ukraine, and they have no intention of changing plan. I think this was again, underlined at the recent speech of President Putin in Sochi, his Delphi speech, the annual speech that he made. I would say this speech was almost like a roadmap for the future, because it basically laid out that the Russians are not interested in a reset of ties with the United States. It made it very clear that the Russians consider the United States to be, enemy number one, that is running the world in a way which is totally unacceptable to the Russians. And the Russians have said within this speech of President Putin that they have a new, let's say, strategy or a new vision for the future, where Russia and some other global powers, like China, the most obvious one, are going to be taking their, rightful place in the world, and the Americans in the West should basically accept that. Of course, that's not acceptable, which is why it's very important, I would say, that the international community increases its pressure on Russia, that tomorrow at the EU foreign ministers meeting, that new sanctions are placed on Russia for not adhering to the Minsk agreement. Because basically, I think Ukraine is a test for the West in terms of its commitment, its strategic vision, and its resolve to hold up, international treaty commitments. Because, basically our word has to be our bond, otherwise the entire system of security assurances that was established is going to be turned over onto its head, and we're going to return to anarchy. And I do think there's a significant risk of that. I mean, not just in this region, but if you go beyond to Korea, Japan, you ask the leaderships of those countries, are you concerned about what's happened in Russia? And they'll say yes, because we don't know if we can trust the security arrangements we have with the United States or whoever else in the future if we were challenged by another power in the region, whether that would be Russia or China or whatnot. I mean, I think this is an important question that needs to be answered. And so far, this hasn't been the case. And of course, this didn't start this year. I mean, this started in 2008. I mean, you can go back to 2008 when the Russians invaded Georgia. I mean, they tested the West's resolve. The West didn't respond with strength then. Basically, the United States came up with a reset, business as usual. And of course, the EU came up with its Eastern Partnership program, but still Russia was allowed to get away with what it did in Georgia. And even today, Russia does not fulfill the criteria of the ceasefire agreement that was signed then between France, the then President Sarkozy, the then Medvedev, and the Georgians. And you could say perhaps if the West had responded more robustly to developments in Georgia, we may not have the situation that we do have today. But at least during the Georgian war, you had George Bush in office, and I know that George Bush is nobody's favourite American president, but at least then the United States sent or they did some sort of, military naval maneuvers in the Black Sea, which perhaps stopped the Russians from coming towards Batumi. I think it was a symbolic. But now in Ukraine, you have all of this talk about the Russians perhaps trying to take a land corridor from Donetsk down to the border with Crimea, passing by the town of Mariupol. Mariupol is a Black Sea port, an important port. So, I mean, if I was somebody of a symbolic position in NATO, I mean, I would call for a NATO maneuver in the Black Sea around Mariupol. But this obviously isn't going to happen. And again, I think this shows, again, the weak response of the international community towards Russia. And again, if you look at defence spending in the region, I mean, thanks to God, the one positive thing that came out of activity in Ukraine is that NATO have actually woken up to the fact that they need to start putting more money into defence spending, waking up to still the threat that's on the border, because they seem to have, gone to sleep over the last few years. So now you've seen countries that didn't want to even contribute the minimum 2% of their budgets to defence spending have actually accepted to do that, which is positive. And we've seen, a return to, let's say, more attention paid to the periphery of Eastern Europe, the Baltic countries, Poland, etc. There's more security attention paid on these countries now, but still, if you look at the defence spending of NATO, I mean, it's compared to what Russia is ready to spend. I mean, Russia is spending 60 billion in 2014, and this is expected to rise to 96 in 2016. And we've seen that Russia is more active around the world globally in its, let's say, its deployment. I guess everybody read in the media about the activities around the G20 summit, the Russian vessels there. I mean, of course, it's provocative. Other areas of the world have also done the same thing. So I do think that Russia does represent a significant security threat. And I do think that so far the West has not responded to it sufficiently. And of course it's easy to say that because I'm an analyst, I'm not actually working for NATO, I'm not in the US government, but I do think that there does need to be some lessons drawn from this, and we need to rethink our approach to Russia, because otherwise who knows what might happen next. I mean, Moldova, Georgia, they're all at threat. And my last word about the Russians is, I would say that Russia has one key tactic in its strategy, and this is to seek out geopolitical vacuums, promote vacuums where they're only nascent, and then seek to fill them by military force if necessary. And this has actually been at the core of Russian expansionism since the time of Ivan III, so that's going back a long time. If the West wants to stop Putin, if it wants to change his approach and his strategy, they need to fill the vacuums to stop them opening in the first place. So far this hasn't happened. So they need to have this approach along with ongoing economic sanctions, which will hurt the Russian economy. The ones that are already on are hurting the economy, maybe not in the short term, but in the medium term and longer term they will have a serious impact. That is the second approach. The third approach is ongoing diplomatic conversations and discussions with the Russians, even though we might think that they're not worthwhile, that we don't get any results from them. It's very important to keep open the diplomatic channels, because whether we like it or not, Russia cannot be isolated, Russia cannot be contained. Russia is an international player involved in many issues of mutual interest to Europe and to the United States, and of course Russia sits on the UN Security Council. So Russia is not Iran. Iran, we slapped sanctions on, threw them into isolation. We cannot repeat the same approach with Russia, and I think actually the approach that we had with Iran, we can actually learn from it how not to deal with a difficult state, because I don't think in many ways the approach that the West had with Iran was any way beneficial whatsoever. So I do think there's some lessons to be learned there. And just to come one word about Turkey, as we're all Turks in the room, about Turkey's position on Ukraine and Russia, because I think we need to say something about that. We all know that Turkey has not aligned itself with the West 100% on Russia. Of course, Turkey has condemned or Russia's violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity, but apart from that, it's been, let's say, rather silent. I think this reflects Turkey's, what Turks would say is their delicate position, that they don't want to upset the Russians because they're reliant on Russia for energy, that they want to continue to have business with Russia, construction, etc., etc. Of course, that's the position of some member states as well, but they didn't really have very much choice. And possibly the issue that for me was the most concerning is the issue of the Tatars in Crimea, but you could say Turkey has not been as vocal or as visible as it could have been of raising the issue of the persecution, because we are talking about persecution now, of the human rights of Tatars in Crimea. Many of them, including the leader of the community, Mr. Jamilov, have been extradited from the region. I know that Prime Minister Davutoglu was in Ukraine a few days ago. Turkey wants to send a human rights exploratory mission to Crimea to investigate what's going on there, how the treatment of Tatars is being carried out. Of course, this is positive and it should be welcomed, but I do think that Turkey should have had a stronger position regarding the Tatar community, because I know that many Tatars in Crimea and elsewhere have been extremely disappointed by the weak position of Turkey, which many of them see as Turkey favouring or preferring to maintain its strong relationship with Russia over the human rights of, let's say, a group of people who are millions of them in Turkey, but have close and blood connections with Turkey. And the other issue linked to that, of course, is Turkey's desire to fill the gaps in the Russian economy or on the supermarket shelves that were left by Russia's blockade of vegetables and fruits and whatnot from EU member states. I mean, Turkey has been one of the countries that has rushed to fill the gap. Of course, they were asked by the EU, please don't do it, you're a candidate country. You should show solidarity with the EU. I mean, personally speaking, I think that's a bit of a joke, considering the EU's treatment of Turkey over the years. I mean, perhaps if the EU had had a fairer approach towards Turkey in regards to its accession talks, maybe Turkey would have been more inclined to say, okay, fine, we understand, we're a candidate, we're going to be a member in 10 years, so as member states we should adhere to this policy and we won't support the Russians, we won't help the Russians. But this isn't the case. I don't know to what extent Turkey has agreed economic deals with Russia for supplying fruit and vegetables, but I do know that Turkey has no intention of reducing or curtailing back its economic and trade ties with Russia. But of course Turkey and Russia don't always see eye to eye, and that comes to the next topic in this European security, which is vis-a-vis Syria. So as I said at the beginning, I mean, I'm not an expert on Syria, I'll start off by saying that, but it's very obvious to most people in the world that ISIL represents a big security threat, not just for the region itself, but far beyond. I mean, I know from my own country, I mean, I'm from the UK, how many people have been recruited to go to Syria to fight with ISIL and unfortunately be involved in actually the ugly, barbaric murdering of people from the West. Is actually horrifying. I mean, I think it's something like at least 3,000 people now from the UK, and this is terrifying. But again, unfortunately, there's no strategy towards Russia in the East. There's a distinct lack of strategy from the West towards Syria, and it's very easy to say as well, the West created the situation in Syria. The West created, or they helped bring, ISIL to life because of the bad strategy of the Americans in Iraq, which you could say started this, then the bad strategy in Syria. But I think blaming the United States, blaming the West in general for what's happening now in Syria is not the answer to it. Everybody expects I would say, the United States to somehow resolve this, to play the lead role in resolving the situation with ISIL. But I think we all know that this is not something that's going to be very easy. It's not something that's going to be able to done in the, let's say, the short to medium term. It's probably something that's going to take many years, if we can even stop them at all, because at the moment there's many people who believe, ISIL are not stoppable, that unless we put, boots on the ground into Syria, they are just going to continue to expand their region of territory far beyond what they already have, into Saudi Arabia and beyond. And I think this is a very, scary prospect, because this has, serious implications for the entire region. But as we know, not one country wants to put soldiers on the ground. But unless we put soldiers on the ground, there's no way we're going to be able to stop this terrorist network. I mean, so far you have a situation where the United States and other allies are bombing Iraq and Syria. I mean, more Iraq than Syria still at the moment, because some countries, including my own country, do not want to bomb Syria. They don't have the support within the parliament in the UK at the moment to take actions in Syria. And of course this goes back to a previous, in the UK anyway, to a previous attempt to be involved, to have a deeper role in Syria, which was blocked by the parliament in the UK. But unfortunately, if you have a situation where no country in the world wants to put boots on the ground, because at the moment the only force that is fighting ISIL is the Kurds. We can be very grateful to the Kurds, even though we know some countries, including Turkey, have issues. Some issues, are quite justified to have some issues. But I don't support Turkey's position, or the policy that Turkey's had towards Syria for the last few years. I don't think it was well thought out. I think it was destructive for Turkey and actually for the region, and I think it's left Turkey in a very difficult situation. I can understand Turkey's concerns regarding the role of the PKK and the PYD, but at the same time, I think when you're faced with such a significant security threat that ISIL represents, to come out and say that PKK is seen as just, let's say, an almost equivalent security threat is ludicrous, frankly speaking, because this is just absolutely not true. I mean, I believe that Turkey should have much earlier, or this actually represented an opportunity for Turkey to make a deal with all the Kurds of the region, to come together and work, let's say, as a united front against ISIL about this threat. But this hasn't been the case so far, so we're still left in this very difficult situation. I was just telling the colleagues at my table, and my brother had asked me, or suggested, because he's here today, why the countries of the region, the Islamic countries themselves, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Jordan, etc., why these countries, instead of saying the United States and the West should resolve this problem because they created it, why don't they take steps to actually play a bigger role in resolving a conflict which is in effect in their background, in their backyard, and which in effect is going to impact on them more than it's going to impact on Europe or the United States, let's say in the short term. But again, you have the same situation. Saudi Arabia is bombing Syria, but at the same time you have segments of society in Saudi Arabia that are very supportive of ISIL, simply because they don't want to have any, let's say, possible rise of the Shia in Saudi Arabia. And again, this is a really zero-sum mentality approach, and this reflects, I think, a problem of the whole entire region, and not just now, but goes back many years. I mean, this is my opinion, and I'm sure you will maybe have something different to say on it. But you have the zero-sum mentality where they say if there's some possibility that somebody else might gain from a certain action, and they might lose, or they perceive themselves as losing, they won't do it. And I think this is extremely short-sighted, because unless, I believe, the countries of the region don't step forward and are ready to play a more significant role in the fight against ISIS, or are ready to let's say show a more united front. And I know it's very difficult apparently for Shia and Sunni to work together, and this is something of course that goes back centuries. This is working against the region and increasing the security threat of the region, and only helping to ISIL, because ISIL is killing Shiite, it's also killing Sunni, it's killing any sort of ethnic group, nationality, organization that gets into its path. So for countries like Saudi Arabia to say, okay, we're going to back, or some parts of Saudi Arabia to say we're going to back ISIL because we're Sunni and they're Sunni, I think this is really, it's actually mind-blowing how this can be the approach, because we've seen ISIL have their eye on Saudi Arabia, they have their eye on many other countries in the region. There needs to be this united front working together with the West, working together basically as a global community against this terrorist threat, because it is a global terrorist threat, and not allow ourselves to be fractured or divided by the fact that we're from different, let's say, civilizations, different factions of Islam, or different factions of any religion, because this is a threat, whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, a Hindu, or whatnot, and that's a fact. And in this respect, my last comment would be on Iran. I think Iran could actually play a very positive role again in this fight against ISIL. But unfortunately, again, Iran has been sidelined because of their nuclear program. Let's hope on the 24th of November, when you have this final meeting of the relevant parties for the solution of the problem with Iran, I really hope that they manage to find a solution to this crisis, because I believe that it will open the way for Iran to have, let's say, a more legitimate role in politics of the region, to be able to strengthen ties between certain countries, which will, I think, will have a positive impact on this whole issue of ISIL. But until then, I also think Iran is one of the few countries as well that's willing to send in boots on the ground. And they've made that clear on several times, but clearly that's not going to be possible until we have a deal between Iran and the United States, which will give Iran a much stronger role in the region, and I think make Iran a more helpful country, or give it a more stronger role to be able to help in the fight against terrorist activity in the region, which I would consider to be beneficial to everybody, despite ongoing concerns from some people that Iran remains a threat to the region. So I will leave my comments there, and I'm willing to answer any questions on any of these topics. And I'm sorry if it was either too long or too short. So.
You mentioned that European Union should do more against Russian intervention to Ukraine, as it's creating the security issues, etc. We know that European Union did an economic restriction and also these sanctions. But yesterday, I think there was a news on the headlines in the European Union that MEPs are calling the High Commissioner to reconsider these sanctions. So while European Union feels that, oh, we are punishing ourselves by putting the sanctions on Russia, and they can't even really decide what kind of reaction we should show. What else you can expect from European Union to do more against Russia's intervention, and also the way that they are dealing with its neighbors?
Well, personally speaking, I don't really expect very much from the European Union at all. I'm disappointed, to say the least, and I guess a lot of people in Ukraine and elsewhere are. But on the sanctions, the EU is split into three groups. Those countries that would like to see personal sanctions and sectoral sanctions put on Russia, which I think would be the right approach to go, given the fact that Russia has not adhered to any of the criteria that was laid down. A second group that will probably accept personal sanctions, and by personal sanctions I mean an extension of this visa ban list, and a third group that doesn't want to do anything. I mean, this third group consider that the sanctions, as you said, are not having any effect on Russia, but rather they're having a negative effect on EU member states. And clearly some of these countries, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Greece, are among them, Italy. I mean, there are some countries that do have some reasons for not supporting sanctions. For example, the Netherlands. The Netherlands doesn't support sanctions because they're in the middle of this investigation into the Malaysian aircraft crash, and they don't want to do anything that could perhaps provoke Russians into not being helpful. But I think, despite the fact that we like to say there's no impact on the Russian economy, I think it's clear there has been an impact on the Russian economy in capital flight out of the country. The ruble is crashed. A number of countries like Rosneft, the big energy company, has had to ask for a big bank loan from Russia to cover it, and this is just after a few months. So I think there's every reason why we need to tighten the sanctions and make it very clear to the Russians that the EU won't be divided, because the Russians really have two objectives. First of all, to make Ukraine into a failed state when Ukraine is on the verge of bankruptcy. And the second objective is to divide member states, to create gaps and spaces that they will be able to fill. And this is something that's starting to take place, because, okay, you could say that the EU has showed more unity, but this unity is very weak, and we already can see that there's divisions among this unity. So they need to increase the sanctions. They need, at the same time, to keep talking to the Russians, because, as I said, no dialogue, this doesn't work either. And they need to continue with their political and economic support towards Ukraine, even though this could be expensive, because if Ukraine does not receive, let's say, a significant amount of money over a long period of time, and we're talking about billions here, not millions, billions, the country will collapse. I mean, the area that's under the occupation, Donetsk, Luhansk, this area was responsible for almost 30% of the country's economy. So it's a significant financial loss. And if there's renewed war in Ukraine, which there's a possible chance of that, this will have a further negative economic impact onto Ukraine as well. And of course, some in the EU say we don't want to give any money because we're going into a black hole. How long are we going to have to give the money for, because we don't have money because of the economic crisis, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, if Ukraine collapses economically, the implications will impact onto EU, which I think will be negative. So we need to keep up this strong, robust approach towards the Russians. We need to show that we're strong. Okay, the sanctions are also having a negative impact on some member states. You see now when you go into the Belgian supermarkets, you have piles of apples and pears. These apples and pears should have been in Russia. So yeah, Belgium producers have suffered, but I think we have to look more to the middle term and long term rather than to the short term. But Russia, I guess, has calculated that there would quickly be sanction fatigue or fatigue about Ukraine, which is why they've maintained the same position that they have up until this point. And at the end of the day, the sanctions will impact not the country necessarily that has the most to lose economically, but the one that fears them the most. And at the moment, the EU seems to fear the sanctions more than the Russians do. But they need to put their fear behind them and maintain a strong and united approach, because if they don't, what Russia has done in Ukraine, we could risk seeing it done, elsewhere, maybe not to the same degree. But there's a lot of, vulnerable areas in and around that neighborhood, including next door in Moldova, which could come under pressure from Russia as well. Nobody has any questions? Okay.
First, maybe I better stand up. Thank you very much for the nice intervention and analysis. But first of all, I have to thank to Golden Rose for excellent breakfast. Today mostly homemade and really nice. I totally agree. Most of your comment related to Russia, but I sometimes think how the other countries, international community gives the power, and Russia uses it because it's a real threat for the economy, and however it has power of energy and others, and uses very well. My concern on this is, which seems to be an immediate agenda, but on the other hand, I feel it is becoming out of the agenda. And this is a real threat for the world. And you analyzed Turkey's position very well related to Syria. I totally agree that Turkey should have been different. But suppose you are an analysis of Turkish government, consulting to them right now, supposing yourself, what would you suggest for the coming future? That is one of my questions. And the second question, on one hand, we say, this is a global threat. On the other hand, what I observe, the international community leave it to the neighboring countries. Okay, they are just giving criticism and this and that, but there is no concrete action against this. They just think in some way, oh, it's a Muslim image, which is not correct, and they are just living as if it is the problem of the area. The word global threat is only in words. What should we do to activate the whole world again, like in the first days of the slaughtering, I would call? And the second thing, suppose yourself you're an analysis and consultant for Turkey, what would you suggest for the near future at least?
Well, I think the whole world realizes that ISIL is a threat, and a significant number of countries from around the world have joined the coalition of Barack Obama and are playing a different role to varying degrees. But unfortunately, this coalition is not enough. I mean, as regards Turkey, Turkey's policy of laying down, criteria that need to be met before they will take on, let's say, a bigger role, or allow, for example, the United States to, fully use, their air base. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with Turkey's obsession about Assad. A few years ago, Assad was Erdogan's almost best friend, and now is enemy number one. I don't think that we should allow, okay, Assad's a bad man, we all know he's a bad man, he's done, bad things, but to make, Assad's departure or Assad not having a role in any sort of process in Syria there afterwards as a reason not to, take on the role that Turkey could take on in the region, I don't find that, acceptable. I don't think it's appropriate for Turkey, as a NATO member. I think Turkey should show, let's say, greater solidarity with its NATO members. Of course, Turkey isn't the only country that wants to get rid of Assad. I guess if we all had the choice, we would say we need to get rid of Assad. But I think that events in the region since the Arab Spring started, have demonstrated to the West, perhaps to maybe the United States the most, that perhaps we need to, keep away more in the future and not involve ourselves in these processes or take such strong positions on whether or not a certain leader should leave or not leave. We already have the experience of Egypt, where it has gone around full circle from having, a dictator leadership to a democratically elected leader who was then ousted by the military with the support, I would say, of a significant part of Egyptian society because they didn't like him or they thought that he was violating their rights. And now we're back again to another military leadership. And has that taught us something? Look at the situation in Libya. now in Syria, where I think perhaps we've had too much to say. The West, I don't think, understands still this region, and I also think it's very convenient for the countries of the region to blame the West and the United States for everything that goes wrong with the region, and then expect the West and the United States to help, again, let's say, mend the problem, because they apparently created the problem. But I think that's shown that it doesn't matter what the West does, it's always, let's say, the target of blame. They can't do right from wrong. So again, I think this brings us back again to the responsibility of the countries of the region. And I do think that they need to take on more responsibility for resolving the situation in Syria, because it's their backyard, it's their, let's say, region of influence. And ultimately, it's these countries that are suffering the most because of what ISIL is doing. Therefore, I think they need to take on a bigger role in responding to it, including sending some of their military into Syria. And that can be seen as fully, unacceptable. But I also think it sends, a stronger message to these radical people in Syria if you actually have Muslim people on the ground in Syria from the neighbourhood fighting these people who are also, of course, they call themselves Muslims, they're representing Islam. What sort of Islam they're representing, is not any Islam that I know, but it's far more relevant, I think, and symbolic, and has more meaning if you actually have Muslim people fighting for their countries and their region, rather than sending in, Americans or British or French, which nobody wants there anyway. They want us to go there and fight, to die. That's clear, because they don't want to fight themselves and die, but it's okay for us to go and fight and die. To have people from the region taking on more responsibility. And as I said at the beginning, yes, we made a mistake in Iraq. I'm very sorry that the UK went to Iraq and ousted Saddam Hussein. And I guess as many people in America would say the same thing. But I don't think we can continue to use this as an excuse for the let's say, the long-term future, to say, you made the mess, so you need to clean it up. There's also a big mess that's created here by the peoples of the region, because they simply can't live with each other. Well, that's what it looks like as somebody looking in, when you see the relationships, the sectarian issues between Sunnis and Shiite. This is something that has nothing to do with the role of the West in the region. This is something that's been there for centuries. And this is an issue, I think, that also needs to be tackled. There needs to be more unity from both in fighting against ISIS, because, as I said, both Sunnis and Shiites are being killed by ISIS.
Thank you for your intervention, Ida. It has been a very interesting debate. I will approach the issue from a different perspective. When it snows in Istanbul, if you watch Turkish TVs, you all see how to fight against snow, how the infrastructure is bad. The kids cannot go to school if snow hits the ground. The schools are cancelled. So it becomes a major topic for some time, and then it gets lost. But if you go to Van, the roads to villages are closed for 6 months because of snow, and nobody really cares about them. In Hakkari, in Erzurum, this story doesn't change. It differs from 1 month to 6 months. The roads are blocked, no hospital, no school, nobody cares. And this is true for the people of the region. And if you look back to region for the last, let's say, 2 centuries, there has been always big battles, but especially in the last 20th century, there was always bloodshed on the ground. And this bloodshed didn't mean anything to anyone, unless it touched to the oil resources. This is how it is perceived. You can judge that it is true, it's false, it's partly true, but this is how it's seen from the region itself. And when it touched to Kuwait, the source of oil, the US came on this and freed the Kuwait by taking almost 15 years of their resources as for the expenses they made in order to save it. Then, when it was again Iraq, a war against Saddam Hussein. When it was Egypt, a major country in the region, they stepped in. But when it was Syria, nobody cared about it. So, snow in the region, bloodshed in the region is quite normal. And now, when it comes to ISIL, many people in the region that I read says that the West is caring about Israel because there are many of their citizens who are coming to the region, learning how to kill, upstream massacres, and they are indeed afraid of themselves to be hurt in the long run. So they are making it this much big news. So it's snowed now in Istanbul, and it's big news, but for the region, it's quite normal. And bloodshed, killing for 20,000 people, 30,000 people, these are yearly incidents in the region. So regional dynamics is not a real threat yet. It doesn't touch to the big societies yet. The boundaries are to the south is Baghdad, which is perfectly protected. To the north it is Kurdistan, which they have their own army, Peshmerga, which they can fight with. And in Syria is already a big anarchy. Nobody knows who is fighting with who there. So if you look at from Turkey, from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, or even from Lebanon, including Syria, the regime, they don't care about it that much, and they will continue not to care about it this much. And I can actually understand the disappointment of the West. It is quite normal. It is the region. And if West really sees a big threat in Israel, I think it's their mission to come on the ground. And all these, theories that Israel will attack Turkey, I think it is nonsense. Israel is shown that they have a very good mindset, a clever mind, to tackle down all the drones, US drones, not to be hit by them. They wander around all in that huge region with just 30,000 people, and they can run the region. So they have a clever mindset which they will continue to govern, which does not really bother the regions that much, the regional powers that much. So I think the approach to the problem from this would mean more for a realist political analysis of the problem. So it is the snow, yes. It means a lot for West, yes. But for the region, it is quite a daily issue, and it is rather smaller issue.
Okay, but I guess, if you would go to Jordan, if you would go to Lebanon, and you would ask the leaderships of those two countries, particularly given the burden that these two countries are carrying in terms of the number of refugees they have from Syria.
Which does not have anything to do with Israel, but the Syrian region.
Well, I would say now it does have something to do with ISIL, because the increase of refugees into both those countries and, as we know, into Turkey is a direct impact of the activities of ISIL. Or maybe you're forgetting about that recent inflow of Syrian Kurds. I think that was a direct impact of ISIL. So I don't agree with you. It's very difficult for them to cope with these refugees, particularly Jordan and Lebanon. Again, this is a failing of the international community, failure A, to provide enough humanitarian assistance, and secondly, a failure to accept those refugees themselves. I think the EU has taken 4% of the total number of refugees, which is extremely shameful. But I don't think, or maybe I'm wrong, as I said, I'm not an expert on the region, I'm not an expert on the Middle East, that the countries of the region are not concerned about what is happening with ISIL in Syria, in Iraq, because I think they have every reason to be concerned. And just coming back, if we go back again to the beginning of the Syrian crisis, I also think in a way, it's unfair to say the international community didn't do what it could have done in Syria. Again, I think this comes back to divisions. We know that they tried to pass UN resolutions on Syria to be able to take a stronger role in Syria, and it was blocked by the Chinese and the Russians, which both have, particularly Russia, different visions for what the future of Syria should look like. So this, again, I think is an issue. But speaking as a British citizen, I can say that I am concerned. Since this incident started, there's been increase, let's say, in according to intelligence of the British government, of course, so-called terrorist cells in the UK and the activities within those terrorist cells, and in a consequence of, I think, ISIL fighters going and coming back and increasing the threat to my country. So I do think it represents a significant threat, and it isn't just being pushed down the agenda. Of course, if it's out of the headline news, which unfortunately I would say it is, unless there's some big thing that happens, which is the case, we shouldn't just believe that it isn't being, still worked on intensively by the United States or the UK or whatever. The EU doesn't have really much of a role to play in this, but it is something that's still very much on the agenda. But yes, more needs to be done.
Okay, thank you very much once more.
Thank you.